Shall we start? Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this UNWTO webinar to launch our recently published guidelines on gender mainstreaming for the tourism sector. My name is Marina Diota-Levi. I'm the head of the Ethics, Culture, and Social Responsibility Department here at UNWTO. Today's webinar is being organized with the kind support of the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ, on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and of UN Women. The guidelines and this event form part of the Center Stage project that aims to put women's empowerment at the heart of tourism reactivation following COVID-19. As a specialized agency of the United Nations, UNWTO's mandate is to support our member states and the tourism sector in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. An integral part of our shared commitment, in particular under Sustainable Development Goal number 5, is the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women in the tourism sector. The twin publications that we will be discussing today have been designed to support governments and businesses to do just that. The first, the Gender Mainstreaming Guidelines for the Public Sector in Tourism, contains tools to support national, regional, local, and other tourism institutions apply an approach to tourism planning that integrates gender equality and women's economic empowerment. The second, the Gender Inclusive Strategy for Tourism Businesses, is a roadmap for tourism businesses of all types and sizes to implement effective strategies for gender equality across their operations. I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists from the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities of Jordan, the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture of Malaysia, the private sector, GIZ, and UN Women. These panelists will be taking a deeper look at these guidelines and how you, the viewers around the world, can use them to bring about a real change in tourism sectors, in your tourism sector, as we restart a more sustainable, resilient, and gender inclusive tourism. Thank you for being with us today on Zoom and the UNWTO YouTube channel, where the recording of the webinar will remain available to watch back after the live event. And now I have the pleasure to pass the floor to today's moderator and lead expert in developing the guidelines, Dr. Lucy Ferguson. Lucy, the floor is all yours, please.
Thank you very much, Marina. Thank you everybody for joining us today. And thank you for all of who have had an input into this very long process of developing these guidelines over many years. And finally, thank you to GIZ, UN Women and UNWTO for having the final push to put together this Center Stage project. And we now have the guidelines, we're very happy to say, available in English, Spanish, and Arabic. So we have both the public sector and the private sector guidelines available in 3 languages. I'm going to talk you just very quickly through what you can find in the guidelines, what you can expect to see here. And then after that, we will go straight to our panelists. So we start with the public sector guidelines. The idea here is that we focus on gender mainstreaming using the support of the UN Women framework on gender mainstreaming to develop that from a tourism specific perspective. We highlight very much the importance of gender mainstreaming at two levels. The programmatic level on the tourism sector is important, but also the importance of gender mainstreaming in public sector tourism institutions themselves. This you can find an explanation of in the guidelines, and this is the leading theme throughout. We also talk about the dual track approach to gender mainstreaming, whereby this means integrating gender equality into all aspects of programming and operational work, but also having specific gender equality targeted initiatives. So those are the two tracks we discuss, and this is how they specifically work in tourism. We talk about different aspects of how this work can contribute to gender equality and what our approach is. Institutional, first of all, then programmatic, and then the thematic approach, which you'll be familiar, those of you who know the work, the Global Report on Women in Tourism, first and second edition, that you can find here are 5 themes: employment, entrepreneurship, leadership, policy and decision-making, education and training, and community, and also our cross-cutting theme, which is the importance of measurement and data. The guidelines then set out a 4-step approach for public sector tourism institutions. I just wanted to say it doesn't necessarily only have to be the National Tourism Authority. This can also as well be local bodies or regional bodies can also take up these recommendations. The first step is to establish the institutional measures necessary for gender mainstreaming in the institution. The second is to integrate gender equality into the tourism policy and program cycle. Next, very important to conduct a gender analysis of the tourism sector. This includes data collection, data analysis, and also qualitative data collection and analysis. And finally, we provide here the gender mainstreaming action plan matrix. So here then the rest of the document, you can find out each of those steps in detail, how to do it. We include checklists to make things as accessible and easy as possible to start working on this. The different steps that need to be taken for gender analysis, etc. We identify some priority actions from which different countries and different authorities can choose. And finally, we provide the gender mainstreaming action plan matrix. The action plan matrix has samples here, sample fictitious examples of how to fill this in. So for example, for step 1 in the institutional area, you will find an objective, actions, budget, timeline, who is responsible, and indicators. So you can work through that for all the different aspects that need to be looked at. So we've made this as accessible as possible. We've included fictitious examples so that when you go to look at this, you can have an idea and a better understanding, and then you contextualize it within your own work. You will find a glossary of key terms, and at the end you will find a template here which you can use for your own work and your own planning. So the public sector guidelines are slightly more extensive than the gender inclusive guidelines for the tourism private sector, which I will turn to now. The private sector guidelines are intended to be applicable and really straight to the point for private sector organizations to get to work on these issues. We frame the private sector guidelines around the UN Women Women's Empowerment Principles, as UN Women is one of the key partners for this work, and also that the Women's Empowerment Principles we consider to be the key guiding framework for gender equality in the private sector. So here again, we have these 4 stages. This is slightly different to the public sector. First of all, to secure high-level support for gender equality, commit to the Women's Empowerment Principles through signing and then action. Step 2 is to assess current progress on gender equality. We recommend to use the gender analysis tool, the GAT, from the UN Women website. It's very easy to find, everything's in here anyway. To review current progress on the thematic areas for women in tourism, that's the 5 areas plus measurement that I previously mentioned. And then finally, to develop an action plan for gender inclusive tourism. So you can see that the 2 sets of guidelines are reasonably similar. We tried to make them as accessible as possible. Here we have the WEPs set out. And then this is the WEP's journey. So you can see how the tourism goals map on to the WEP's goals. So this is here we set out, so what do we consider to be the private sector contribution in terms of the thematic areas, and then how these relate to the women's empowerment principles. We've tried to make this as clear as possible for tourism private sector companies so they understand how they're working specifically with the different areas in terms of the principles of the women's empowerment principles, the WEPs. So we again have priority areas for the private sector, but then they can be selected depending on the context. And again, checklist of things to look at. How far have you gotten this so far? So while there is a specific WEPs tool, this is what you can use to assess your progress in different aspects in terms of tourism more specifically. Then again, just as with the public sector guidelines, we have a matrix here with some examples. So this is again to try and make it less abstract, to make it as practical as possible. So these are again fictitious examples from fictitious tourism companies and some examples that you can use to have an idea of what you might put for specific objective, actions, budget, timeline, responsible staff and indicators for each of the thematic areas. And again, these go alongside the WEPs and working through the WEP cycle. We have a glossary again, as in the other one, in case there's any terminology that's unfamiliar. And finally, we provide the templates, which you can use then to adapt to develop your own plan. So I'm now very pleased to introduce the first panel, which we're going to discuss, first of all, the public sector guidelines. I'm very pleased that today we have with us a really excellent panel, both for the public and private sector. For today's presenters, we have Ansam Usama Malkawi, the advisor to the Minister and the Director of Communications and International Cooperation in the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in Jordan. Thank you and welcome. We have Dr. Yasmin Yassim, Senior Director of Tourism Policy and the International Affairs Division of the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture of Malaysia. Welcome. We have Shivangi Srivastava, Coordination Specialist at UN Women. Welcome, Shivangi. And last but not least, we have Daniela Moreno Alarcón. She is a gender and tourism specialist and one of the key specialists and consultants on this Center Stage project. So we have some key questions that we have put out to the panelists. There are 3 questions that we've asked. So the first question, which stakeholders need to be mobilized in order for these guidelines to be applied in public tourism institutions? So the first question is about stakeholders. Secondly, what do you think are the practical challenges involved in implementing these guidelines in public tourism institutions? Practical challenges is the second question. And the third question is about what resources and support are required in order to achieve the institutionalization of gender equality in public tourism institutions. Now, each speaker is going to address the question or the questions that are most relevant to their own work and expertise. The first panel will last 20 minutes, and then we move on to the private sector panel, which will be a further 20 minutes. So first of all, I invite Ansam Malkawi from the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities from Jordan to please take the floor and answer the question.
Good evening, everybody, and good morning for whom it's morning time. Thank you for this invitation. I'm lucky to be part of this session. I consider myself, to be honest, as lucky because I'm handling the portfolio of gender at MOTA. Choosing the question to answer, I will choose the third one. And talking about the resources that help the public sector for gender inclusion and for women empowerment in specific. And I will start with the highest level of strategic and policies. We believe that to spread the idea or to implement any idea, we need to put solid infrastructure for that. And for tourism, we have national tourism strategy in Jordan It is launched for the years 2022, and the main issue of it, or the essential, is gender inclusion. And based on this national strategy, tourism strategy, we create an action plan for gender and inclusion. And this gender and inclusion, I'm happy to say that most of the pillars or the ideas related or come with the guidelines that you prepare, that you show us and display now. And we built the action plan for gender inclusion for tourism parallel with the national strategy 2022-2025, and this going up with the same pillars that you mentioned, because it is already adopted by UNWTO, and we work as action plan for these pillars as entrepreneurship, education and learning, civil, local communities and civil, and of course institutional. And talking about the institutionalization in specific, we believe that to follow up this issue, we need a body. And based on that, we create a department in the structure for empowerment and for inclusion, and working in a different issue. And to follow up and to be, let me say, as institutionalization and for infrastructure. So somebody to follow up everything, not to be a portfolio or a file. So these pillars were put and related, or we break it down for projects, and we implement. Some of them started to be implemented, and others we are have networking with donors and implementers to adopt these projects. I would like to talk about the, we call it a success story at MOTA. We have the project as center stage. We are part of this project as Jordan member state, and the success story, I'm talking about capacity building for the public sector. We already have a training course for a part of this center stage for MOTA employees for let me say TOT, and this will help us for the coming awareness workshops that plan to be in May. Recently we finished also another training for 4 of us as MOTA employees for gender assessment. And to be honest, when we do the exercise, we feel that we gain the experience, by filling the or by doing the homework, and it is back to the guidelines. It is following this guideline. It is an infrastructure and easy to work in this. Thank you for Daniela, because she's our instructor in this. Talking about the partnership, all the strategy was led by the private sector, and we are proud to say that we were the facilitator for them, but it was led and created by the private sector. And the implementation, as I mentioned, it will be done by our partners as donors and implementers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ansam. Thank you for your very detailed and concise presentation. I'll pass now, please, to Dr. Yasmin from Malaysia. You're muted, Yasmin. You're muted. We can't hear you, Yasmin.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Dr. Ferguson. Esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So the question posed to Malaysia today, tonight is, what resources and support are required in order to achieve the institutionalization of gender equality in public tourism institutions? I would like to start my intervention tonight or today by saying that this question is addressed by Malaysia through three main strategies. Basically, the first one is inclusive policies for tourism development. The second, a gender balanced budget. And lastly, leadership and collective action. In Malaysia, the government's national development agenda has upheld a vision of shared prosperity, inclusiveness, and sustainability, which is further translated into efforts to promote gender equality in all sectors. For the tourism sector, the overarching framework guiding this is our Malaysia's National Tourism Policy 2020 to 2030, which is based on the three pillars of competitiveness, inclusiveness, and sustainability, and aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals in its 6 transformation strategies. So I will straight focus on the strategy that is relevant to our question tonight, which is strategy 5. It is aimed at promoting a sustainable and responsible tourism with specific initiatives which aim to elevate the career path development of women and youths through upskilling and to practice inclusive tourism development to include women, youths, and disadvantaged groups, particularly in ecotourism and community-based tourism activities, which have been identified as Malaysia's main areas of strength and which we continue to promote extensively. As a result, one example worth highlighting would be the Batu Putih Community Ecotourism Cooperative and Misolawalai Homestay in the East Malaysian state of Sabah, a recent recipient of the inaugural Best Tourism Villages by UNWTO Award. Notably, the village cooperative has generated significant economic impact for the surrounding 4 villages of the Batu Putih community, and particularly for the women who provide homestay, accommodation, and guiding services, receiving permanent wages and sharing in the profits of the cooperative. The second strategy, which is a gender-balanced budget. Apart from having inclusive policies in place, the government's gender-responsive budget 2022 has committed towards providing specific incentives and financial support to support an inclusive recovery, especially to help women entrepreneurs if affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mandatory appointment of at least 1 woman on the boards of public listed companies. These are examples of the initiatives implemented under this. So special allocations to increase women's participation in the workforce through leadership and training programs. Incentives under the National Entrepreneur Group Economic Fund for Women in the Workforce and the My Kasih Capital Program to help women generate income from their homes, including a startup capital and training for online businesses expected to benefit some 5,000 women, including 2,000 single mothers. And lastly, the last strategy or the third strategy is leadership and collective action. Finally, I believe an effective approach has to involve strong leadership and collective action jointly driven by both the public and private sectors, as well as civil society organizations, by encouraging more open dialogue, supporting women-focused organizations and social enterprises in tourism. The public sector has a leading role in bringing issues of gender equality to the forefront. Interestingly, the second global report on women in tourism in 2019 found that gender equality issues have not been a priority topic in Asia and the Pacific, contributing to a lack of data and research on gender and tourism in the region. Towards this end, Malaysia is proud to have hosted the inaugural UNWTO Regional Conference on the Empowerment of Women in Tourism in November 2021 here in Kuala Lumpur, which brought together more than 600 participants to advance the tourism sector's contribution to gender equality and women's empowerment across the Asia-Pacific region. Malaysia's Minister of Tourism, Arts and Culture, Her Excellency Datuk Sri Nancy Shukri, one of the few female tourism ministers in the region, has been greatly supportive and takes the opportunity to promote tourism businesses run by women on the international stage, as they make up more than half of tourism enterprises in Malaysia. From retail craft items and tour guide services or homestay accommodation to community heritage and cultural experiences. In continuing this momentum, the UNWTO's gender mainstreaming guidelines provide a practical tool for national tourism administrations to take this agenda forward towards unleashing the full potential of women's contribution to the tourism economy, particularly with regards to some of the key pillars of women economic empowerment, access to capital, access to market, skills and capacity building, women's leadership and agency, as well as innovation and technology in the tourism sector. With that, my sincere thanks and appreciation goes to the UNWTO Department of Ethics, Culture and Social Responsibility and the Center Stage Project for coordinating these meaningful initiatives, and we look forward to working closely together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for representing Malaysia and the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture. I'll pass quickly to Shivangi Shrivastava from UN Women, and just remind you that we have the 3 thematic questions to guide our discussion. Thank you, Shivangi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy. Very pleased to be here and extremely delighted to represent UN Women in this panel. I really want to start thanking our colleagues at UNWTO, Marina and Ben and Lucy, for putting this very visionary project together, because I want to situate the guidelines in a sort of a broader context. 54% of tourism workforce is women. And as we all know, all of us here on this panel know, women are employed in positions of precarity, low wages. As a Malaysian colleague was also mentioning, that her project is talking about equal wages, equal representation. So this project could not be more timely, because what the pandemic has done has further frayed the experiences of women in tourism at whatever levels they may be participating in the tourism sector. And as you know, the tourism sector has great potential to unleash the power of women. And so I think in that context, I think UN Women is very proud to partner with esteemed colleague GIZ, and of course on the guidance of UNWTO on the Center Stage project. And I love the name of the project, because it's really putting women at the center stage itself. Now, in terms of the gender mainstreaming guidelines, what gender mainstreaming really is to really put women at the mainstream of the topic or a mainstream of an issue. You know, it really is I know sometimes it can be an esoteric concept, but what it is to put the concerns and the experiences and the perspectives of women at the mainstream. And I think what the guidelines do, both for the public and private sector, is exactly that. It is analyzing the impact and the implications of any issue or any topic, any project, differentially on all men, all women, all genders, I should say, and making course corrections or differential sort of steering the course in the correct way. And I think I'm speaking primarily to question 2, Lucia, sorry, I forgot to say that, which is really the practical challenges, and what UN Women finds that there are some sort of buckets of challenges that cross many different spheres and topics, including tourism. Number 1 is the invisibility of women, by which I mean the lack of data, the lack of recording of the experiences, where this could be a woman selling some small thing at a beach somewhere in some country that you visit. This could be a woman working in an industry, in a tourism organization. This could be a woman helming a tourism organization that she's trying to climb so there's a whole broad bucket of challenges, and recording the data and having the data is extremely important. And I know that the Global Tourism Report led under UNWTO, the second, and the UN Women was part of that, the second World Tourism Report tried to shed a light on this important topic. The data gaps are very important. I think data leads me to gender analysis, because if you don't have data, you don't have good gender analysis, and you're not able to kind of assess what is the impact that you're trying to create and what is the barriers that women are facing. So I think those are key important topics that, that trip us when we try to do mainstreaming, implement mainstreaming. I think in terms of the guidelines itself, I think they're very visionary because they're very comprehensive. The roadmap that you talked about, or the matrix, the gender mainstreaming matrix that is part of the guidelines, give a very comprehensive view on how these mainstreaming problems can be tackled across institutional, which is making sure that women are hired, they are retained, they are promoted. This could be in programmatic, that the programs are designed and have gender analysis to design good programs, and also on thematic areas, which include, which came out of the tourism, the second global tourism report, which is entrepreneurship, employment, leadership, education and training, community and data. So I think the matrix offers a wonderful opportunity for interested institutions, public institutions, to dip into this work. And I think one thing I want to say, Lee was saying, just last point, because I don't know how I'm doing on time, that the matrix, and the checklist in the matrix, you can enter gender mainstreaming anywhere. So it's not that you do everything, you can do everything as an institution. I mean, that's our ideal wish, but even if you can start small, you can start at, even if you could start a better hiring practice, or even if there is, you pay equally to your male and female employees, or you have in your programs and activities that you're designing as a tourism institution, you are able to have that gender balance, or you're able to have that gender responsiveness. There are many entry points, I think, as Ansam pointed out also in the National Tourism Strategy, or as Dr. Yasmin was pointing out in the very comprehensive policy from Malaysia, that there are various entry points. And I want to just say that you can start anywhere. It all leads to a virtuous cycle. The important thing is to start the work. And that's why I'm very, very proud to be here from UN Women to do this work with all of you. And as I was working on these guidelines, I just thought of all the women I'd met in my travels across the world. We all travel, we love to travel. Of course, that has been on pause, but just thinking of all the women we've met in various capacities who, and I found it very inspiring and a wonderful opportunity created, for UN Women to partner with you. And I think that's my few cents. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll pass to my dear colleague, Daniela Francisca Moreno Alarcón, who has also worked with the guidelines and with the action plans for the 4 countries of the Center Stage project. Daniela, if you could look at the return to the question, please, and also just try to keep to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this project. So I'm going to answer question number 2. So I'm going to answer this question based in my own experience on the field working on gender and tourism. So one of the first things that I would like to highlight is, before starting a process like this one, I highly recommend you to organize encounters with the key stakeholders. Why? Because you need to be on the same page before starting a process like this one. You need to know what are the thoughts. Maybe you're going to receive some feedback from the key stakeholders to really understand what are the entry points to implement the guidelines. And also because it happens that some stakeholders are not aware of how important they are for reducing gender inequality in tourism. So this is something very important to achieve. We can see in the guidelines that capacity building set the foundations for gender responsive tourism in any kind of organization, right? But also capacity building is something very important to identify resistance against gender equality in tourism. Unfortunately, you're going to identify and you're going to face resistance against gender equality in tourism along the implementation of the guidelines. So we have to be prepared to deal with this kind of situations, and acknowledge is something very important. It's like a negotiation all the time. We have to make negotiation with different resistance in order to be able to implement entire guidelines. For sure, the public sectors must lead the way to include gender in the mainstream, but also public sector have to include gender equality in tourism mainstreaming. This is very important. So in order to do that, it's very important to implement gender analysis in tourism linked to tourist-related activities. So this will help us to really identify what are the main problems, the main gender concerns that we are going to have at the core of tourist development. This depends on every context, of course. Another important issue that I would like to highlight today is that, of course, these guidelines are promoting gender analysis in tourism through the 4th step, but also these guidelines are going to help us to unpack gender concerns in a particular context, making it tourism sensitive. This is a very important advice for you. We have to have that capacity to really understand what all the gender concerns at the core of tourism development, but also related to the industry as well. Another issue that I want to share with you, as you may know, people working in the public sector may change every 4 years, more or less, in the vast majority of countries. So therefore, every activity must be supported by a terms of reference, for example, or also by a memorandum of understanding. And it has to be binding. Binding is a very important word when we implement this kind of guidelines. We have to support binding actions. For example, my personal experience, I have developed many terms of reference to support gender mainstreaming in tourism. And in some countries, the terms of reference has been debated in the parliament to guarantee binding actions. Okay, this must be a sustainable process, a sustainable journey to guarantee gender mainstreaming in tourism. Another point is that the gender expert is not the only person in charge of all this process. This is a teamwork. The gender expert is the facilitator in order to guarantee gender mainstreaming, but we need support from all the rest of the department that are in that particular organization linked to the public sector. And the last thing that I would like to highlight is that, of course, budget. We can see in the guidelines, budget to finance gender actions are very important, but this action must be backed up by a gender analysis. If we don't do that, we can even be supporting gender harmful actions as well. And we can see through these guidelines how we can do that, how we can avoid that kind of situation. Another point that I would like to stress that these guidelines are also a very good opportunity to promote gender budgeting in tourist development as well, under the step number 2. So this is a very transformative activity to guarantee gender mainstreaming in tourist development. Why? Because gender budgeting is like a kind of gender assessment to the current tourist-oriented budget to allocate using gender lens. So this is a very transformative kind of work that I think that through these guidelines, we are going to be able to support in many contexts and in many processes related to gender and tourism. So that are my answers. Lucy, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent intervention. In order to give everyone time to speak, we'll pass straight to the private sector discussion. We have 3 panelists with us today. We have Layali Nashashiri, who is Director of Public and Community Relations at Movenpick Hotels and Resorts in Jordan. We have Julia Karst, who's the head of the project Her and Now at GIZ, a German International Development Agency, and Cynthia Castro Villalobos, who's the co-founder of Boomerang Effect, a consultancy firm which works on gender equality issues in the tourism sector. I'm also very pleased to say that we have with us Anna Falt, who is the head of the Women's Empowerment Principal Secretariat at UN Women, and she's just going to speak very briefly after Cynthia, just to talk about the links between the gender mainstreaming guidelines for the private sector and the women's empowerment principles. So I'd ask the 3 speakers again, please, to stick to your 3 minutes. Here are the questions that we had for discussion. Who needs to be mobilized? What are the practical challenges? And what resources and support are required? So I will pass directly to Nayeli. Welcome.
First of all, thank you very much for including me in this. I'm really thrilled and happy to be among. Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Layali. We can hear you.
I was saying thank you so much for including me in this fruitful and informative session. Thank you again. I would like to talk about who needs to be mobilized in order of these guidelines. First of all, as Movenpick Chain, since we joined or be a signatory of UN Women Empowerment, Gender Equity, we raise, we are raising female workforce all around our hotels in Jordan, plus our owning, affiliated companies who owns and the owning company of those hotels. Also, I would like to say about the gender measures are or should be approved, and it is how it is to ensure our activities to include gender perspective, and to use gender sensitive language to fight gender stereotype, build awareness, and promote women in non-traditional sectors, and avoid gender statements when sending letters, reporting, communication, and including job opportunity. As well as I would like to mention that the government should provide more incentives to businesses to include women in the sector. Also, the vocational and educational entities must provide advanced skills and knowledge and increase on-job training programs to have a higher skilled women in the sector. And also to include a quota for women to be on board and higher representation in on board. Also, Parliament and stakeholders must review laws. As you know, in Jordan, the labor law does not allow long working hours for women, as well as to work at night shifts. So I would say Parliament and stakeholders must review laws and regulations, as currently some of the laws in Jordan limits women working hours, which contradicted with tourism sector requirements sometimes. Tourism sector needs to feature more success stories of women and make sure the successful women transfer knowledge and experiences to junior women to join women in the sector. So this is my opinion about the private sector for tourism. Now, the other question, practical challenges, I would say, shortage of existing support system for women in the private sector, such as nurseries to help women fulfill their duties towards their families and work. Professional associations are not advocating among local communities to open and engage more women at work. This is what we are facing in tourism sector and in Jordan with regards to women empowerment.
Thank you so much, Layali. Thank you for your interventions and for keeping so nicely to the time. I will pass on again now to Julia from GIZ. Julia, welcome.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Pleased to be here, and very interesting discussion so far. At the outset, I have to put a small disclaimer. I lead a project implemented by GIZ in India, which promotes women entrepreneurship in India. We work with women both to start enterprises as well as to scale up existing enterprises. We're not a tourism-focused project in terms of our sector focus. But we do have quite a few tourism enterprises as part of the business that we've supported. So I think I'll be speaking mostly about, or focusing mostly about, how can you promote women entrepreneurship, which I think is an important part of when you talk about increasing the representation of women in tourism. in fact, tourism emerged as, when we started the project, we did a value chain analysis in the key states of India where we're working. And tourism did emerge as one of the top sectors, top promising sectors for women entrepreneurship in most of these states. And I'm going to pick up, I think, on some of the points mentioned here earlier, which is to say that a lot of the women entrepreneurship, I think, is concentrated in tourism-related services. So things like, home-based accommodation, but also food and shopping, cultural festivals, things like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for strengthening women entrepreneurship in these sectors. When it comes to practical challenges, I think, or in my experience in our project, I think they're very similar, or in fact identical to the general challenges faced by women entrepreneurs in India or in other countries, which I think range across a lot of technical barriers, such as access to information or funding or markets when it comes to building your business. But I think they're, in some aspects, maybe more pronounced in tourism too. And what I mean by that is that at the core of these technical barriers, at least in India, are patriarchal social norms that govern the place of women in society and the economy. So women are restricted from, legally restricted, for example, from land ownership, from property rights, from owning property, but also, for example, restricted in their mobility due to safety concerns, things like that. And when you talk about tourism, or when you think about women entrepreneurship and tourism, in core tourism functions, for example, such as guides or working as guides or things like that, I think those social norms come into play much more strongly, and they actually limit women from taking up these professions. So I think anyone wanting to strengthen women entrepreneurship in tourism, I think, needs to take account of these social norms and work on those constraints and impediments to women entrepreneurship. I think one way that can be done, and here I think I'm moving on to question number 3 in terms of how do you tackle those challenges. I think things that can be done, of course, are, and that's an experience that we've made in our project, is to focus on communication and outreach campaigns, and really talking, like portraying role models, talking about women entrepreneurs, putting women entrepreneurs, to use the term of your project, at the center stage of the societal discourse on women entrepreneurship, to change those norms. And I think in terms of promoting more women entrepreneurship, it comes back to more general interventions, I think, to train incubators and other NGOs and other support organizations working with entrepreneurs on gender issues, so that they're able to incubate and accelerate more women entrepreneurs, including in tourism. Yeah, and I think that's picking up a point that was mentioned by my predecessor here, training private sector companies to be more gender sensitive and to employ more women among their workforce. Thank you. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. I will move on now to Cynthia. Cynthia's also been a colleague with us working on this Center Stage project in the training of trainers. So it's lovely to see you, Cynthia. Please go ahead. And just before you speak, I just wanted to remind you that the publications are available in the UNWTO e-library. I believe Ben just shared the links with you there in the chat. So please go to the e-library to access these publications for free. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Lucy. Very happy to be with all of you today. So I want to answer a little bit about question 2 and 3 about the challenges and also resources we can use. I had the experience of working with the first organization that was certified in Costa Rica with the gender seal, and it was actually a tour operator. So we had to face a lot of challenges when we started working on this in 2016. First, it was about creating the business case on why leaders in tourism should invest in advancing in these topics, why there's a return of investment, why there's social impact, etc. If I only had all the best practices and business case that are now on the global report of women in tourism. So I think we have advanced so much with all the work that all of you are doing, and there's a lot of resources now that can help during this path. Second part was that we would see that a lot of organizations would develop actions with actually measuring where their gaps were. So those actions wouldn't solve the real issue. And this has to do with what we have been speaking before, that we're speaking about social norms and how bias affects different processes during recruitment, during who we decide to hire, the supply chain, etc. So we had to convince the sector why it was important for them to measure their gaps, but there was not as many tools to do that as there is today. And I know that the UN World Tourism Organization, has been working with UN Women with the different tools also that have been developed to measure gaps. So you have the web gender analysis tool and other instruments that you can use for that. And then another challenge we had was, how do we develop an action plan for this specific sector when we had not such best practices as you have today already identified and this business case is already developed. So I just want to mention some of the things we did in that time. And it was like, for example, identifying there are more women drivers that are tour guides, because they get more the opportunity to have the buses in order to practice and obtain their driver license. But then this company had to develop a whole strategy where they would lend their buses to women so they could obtain their driver license. So even actions like this, Costa Rica still doesn't have a parental leave for men, but the private sector, and thanks to all of this work, advanced and has a parental leave even when still the government hasn't advanced in this aspect yet. We were able to close gaps in different departments, buy more from women entrepreneurs. And now that I see the mainstreaming guidelines, I see so many areas where we could do much more that we didn't identify then. So now you have the opportunity to use these guidelines to identify gaps in more areas using the different categories of, for example, employment, entrepreneurship, leadership, education, training, community, civil society. It also gives you a very nice way to build up concrete goals according to the best practices. So I only wish I had all the tools you have now. And I just want to invite you to take the best advantage of it. Remember that you have the global report of tourism, and you have the guidelines online and all these best practices that I know Lucy and the team have done a big effort to find. So I wish you the best of luck in this process.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. Thank you to the three presenters, and I'm very pleased to have with us today Anna Falt, who's the head of the Women's Empowerment Principles Secretariat at UN Women. And I'm just going to ask Anna to say a few words on the links between the Women's Empowerment Principles and the work we've done here on the Gender Mainstreaming Guidelines. Thank you, Anna.
No, thank you very much, Lucy, and thanks for this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the Women's Empowerment Principles. There has been a great conversation so far, and I'd just like to kind of wrap up the conversation from the Secretariat's perspective. First of all, just to kind of position the Women's Empowerment Principles, they were set up about 12 years ago to help drive gender equality in the workplace, marketplace, and community. It has also a strong element of delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment. So far, we have 6,300 companies that have made this public commitment, and in more than 150 countries. Why have they done so? These business leaders have done so because they believe that gender equality helps them drive community engagement. It strengthens their brand, and they see that it contributes to the broader sustainability of their business. From internal side, it helps them to attract and retain talent. It helps, and we see with the new generations that are making decisions based on their very, very strong values of sustainability and human rights. So we see that customers are choosing the products and services that are put out by companies because they make those decisions based on the values. But we also see investors paying more attention to companies that have these values in place. And we heard earlier about the return on investment, but they do that also because it's a risk mitigation factor in their investment decisions. So just to kind of bring that business case that is very clear, it is about human rights, it's about women's rights, but it's also shown over time through a lot of research and evidence that is also very, very good for business. So the guidelines that are being put out today is our joint effort to really galvanize this in the tourism sector. There's a lot of benefits, as we heard from the other speakers, to be gained from this. And the business sector, particularly, but the tourism sector at large, has so much to contribute to gender equality and women's empowerment. We have the gap analysis tool to help to understand the content. We have also tools that help to understand the process of putting these efforts and these actions in place. And we have hundreds of resources that can help organizations to better understand what they can do. Focusing on internal strategy, governance, leadership, the talent, etc. Focusing on the external, which is very important. It's about the customers, the community, but also about the brand and how the brand can position itself to eliminate gender stereotypes and help change social norms through that. But there's also an element of enabling environment. We heard that also earlier. It's about culture and data. Both driving inclusive culture is an effort to help drive gender equality, but data speaks volumes. Data can help both understanding what's going on inside the company, but also out in the community and in the supply chain. So I congratulate on this launch event today. And just for those that are listening, I invite you to adopt the Women's Empowerment Principles, and we take it from there, and we'll make a great difference together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'd like to say thank you to all of the speakers who've been with us today for sharing your insights, knowledge, experiences. Thank you to the participants who are here with us on the Zoom, to those who are watching live on YouTube and those who are watching later on YouTube at any time. Thank you so much for being with us on this long journey. We're still quite close to the beginning. We've been going a long way. We will keep going, working with the public sector and the private sector and civil society to work together to increase the potential of the tourism sector to contribute to women's empowerment and gender equality. So just to close off now, I will pass to Ben Owen from UNWTO, who will just share some closing remarks. So thank you again, and we hope to see you all soon on this journey.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and to all of the panelists for the very interesting discussions. Just before we end today's webinar, on behalf of UNWTO, I would like to extend our sincere thanks to the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities of Jordan, the Ministry of Tourism, Arts of Culture of Malaysia, Movenpick, Aqaba, Jordan, Boomerang Effect in Costa Rica, and of course our long-standing partners who have helped to make all of this possible, GIZ, the BMZ, and UN Women. Now, we at UNWTO hope that all of you watching around the world today have enjoyed today's webinar as much as we have and have found it useful. Both a reminder that both publications for the public sector and for the private sector are available for free to be accessed at any time on the UNWTO e-library. They're currently available in English, in Spanish, and in Arabic, and we have the French version coming soon. So we strongly encourage you to download the guidelines and follow the simple steps that they provide, so that together we can restart a tourism that is more sustainable, resilient, and gender inclusive. So finally, a reminder that today's webinar has been streamed on YouTube. It will stay there for you to watch back at any time and share within your networks and on your social media. We very much encourage you to do that. So we wish all of you the very great rest of your day, night, or morning, depending on where you are. And thank you again to Lucy and all of our distinguished panelists today for an excellent event. Goodbye.